today's focus is going to be on pastures for goats, and also I'm going to cover a little bit about hay for goats as well too. Good morning, I'm Leslie from Cylon Rolling Acres, and I raise grass-fed goat on pasture, a few sheep too. But this morning I am going to live Q&A, and today's focus is going to be on some questions about best pastures for goats, and also I'm going to cover a little bit about hay for goats as well too. So good morning for those of you who are joining me, and as usual I will be having the replay available here on Instagram if you're here watching it here. Also I'll have it on my blog as well, along with more detailed show notes that I cover, just because I know sometimes there's things you can't always show in real time, or resources and links and things like that. So what is the best pasture for goats? And I think just to step back on that topic, it's really, for our approach for our farm, as you may know if you've been following us along, our goats are raised all on pasture throughout the year, with the exception of winter, because we're in Wisconsin. The reality is we do have to feed hay, but we've really have taken an approach of looking at like our hay quality and diversity and what works best in our environment, and also continuing to develop a herd that thrives on being raised on pasture. And so it's been a long game in terms of getting there, but we've learned a lot along the way. So a few things before I get into what the pasture variety we have and that we use. My approach to, and as I do this, I'm just kind of looking at my notes because I want to make sure I don't miss anything. But, my approach has really been based on a few things. So one, dietary preference of goats. As most know, they tend to prefer browse. They also do eat weeds, and they will eat forages, which are grasses and legumes. I also base it on observation as well too. So I found that, if I think about like pastures versus even hay too, that our goats, I've noticed they tend to eat the legumes. So that would be like alfalfa and clovers over grasses, and that would be true with fresh pasture and also with dry hay. I found that preference is even stronger when it comes to dry hay. I think a lot of it has to do with the nutritional content and the value that they get out of it. I've also focused on what works well in our local, I call it like environment, in our climate. So what works for us in the upper Midwest might be a little bit different if you're in the southern part of the country. So kind of keep that in mind as you think about how you might take this approach and adapt it for what you're doing in your own practices with your goats. So I've also looked at what plant species are native to our area, and some of that, the beauty of that is actually a lot of those native plant species will start to kind of become established the more you graze, and you really don't have to do a lot to actually plant those seeds in your pasture, because they will start to show up over time just from the native seed bed. So for example, we've seen that a lot with clovers. We've even seen some alfalfas come through that way, not a lot, but a little bit. And then of course, some other grasses and other species as well. And then I also look for, keep in mind, plant species that have antiparasitic properties. So that's more from a preventative nature in terms of helping manage animal health and well-being. It's not going to be a deterrent if you have major issues, but it will help in the overall holistic approach to managing your livestock. Also pasture diversity. If you think about replicating a prairie setting, or even other areas in nature, there's a lot of diversity, and that means that your pasture will thrive more, because if there's more diversity, you have more strength and variability in weather changes. So for example, we're more in a drought now, while our pastures aren't looking so hot. There are species that are thriving and doing better because they're more drought tolerant. You also think about the time of different plant species growth over the growing season. If you have a variety of plant species, some are going to are going to peak more in the springtime. Some will have more growth in the late summer or rebound in the fall. So there's some variability that way. Also, when you look at the good bugs, so the other critters in the ecosystem that help everything kind of continue to work with soil health and also keeping some of those predators out of there. I think of like when we've had issues with our hay, which is predominantly alfalfa, it's, some of that is because we have also other critters or bugs coming in that don't have, or using our field as their food source. They don't have other I'd call it like insect predators coming and taking care of them. So the more diversity you have, it just helps things continue to thrive. And then, of course, observations, as I mentioned, on goats' behavior. And so I found over time, and if you raise goats or you're starting to get into goats, you'll realize pretty quickly there is not a lot of research out there for goats. And what is out there is pretty minimal. And using your own observation of what works well with your goats is a really good place to also incorporate to what you're doing, in addition to what you find for research. So what's in our pasture variety? So we have a mix of it. So in our pasture itself, it's a mix of clovers. So we have white clover, red clover, and sweet clover. We have alfalfa, chicory, plantain. You can go ahead and laugh at me on how I pronounce some of these. Bird's foot trefoil, tall fescue, meadow fescue, Italian ryegrass, perennial ryegrass, Alaskan brome, meadow brome, timothy, festoleum, orchard grass, and we have probably a lot more than that. And so those are some species that either we've planted, purposely planted, or I've observed. And we're, in how we source our pasture mix, we've used a grazing mix, a pasture mix specifically for grazing. So that's a pretty diverse species. And then we've also taken a look at what we've learned from observation and research I've done on what provides what goats either have preference for or nutritional value, and also incorporate that in. And one thing that I just kind of note that I kind of laugh is that my husband, who's also the hunter outdoorsman, also appreciates this, is that I will also look to what works well for deer food plot mixes, because goats and deer are actually very similar when it comes to nutritional preferences and dietary needs. And so I've kind of taken a nod to some of those mixes as I look at how we incorporate our pasture mixes. And so we've, some of the other species I've talked about, alfalfa and clovers we've added in, bird's foot, trefoil, chicory, and plantain are other ones that we've actually purchased in addition to the pasture mix to incorporate. Oh, thank you for watching from Japan. I'm glad you're here. So then we are also, as I talked about before, native species are coming in on their own as well. So when we are planting our pastures, we're actually either interseeding or doing no-till. So that means that we're not totally converting a pasture. And so either we've used the no-till, which is a way you're not disturbing the soil, or we're taking a disc and we're lightly disking the surface. So not totally... I'd say removing the plant residue that's there, but then seeding into there at the deepest setting of our cedar, which was before we had a no-till drill. And that's actually worked pretty well too, because we were able to, it's kind of like a modified no-till approach. And then as we've continued to graze our goats, every time we graze them, that's also allowed for new species to come in or get established as well. So that's a little bit on pastures for meat goats. And so now I'll talk a little bit about approach to hay species when you think about growing hay or sourcing hay for goats. And so for us, for our hay, we've actually focused more on, it's still a diverse mix, but nowhere near as diverse as our pasture mix. So really we focused on alfalfa grass mix, and knowing that over time clover will just naturally fill in. We found that our goats tend to do a little bit better with the alfalfa for nutrition, and then the grass has worked, has been kind of incorporated into that as well. But I found that because our goats are always in some type, they're not in maintenance mode, they're always in some type of production mode, whether that they're raising, they're nursing little ones, or they're pregnant, or they're growing in their young stock, that they need a high quality hay to continue to grow. And so that, and if you've raised goats, it's, if you're looking to buy hay, a lot of people think, oh, they'll eat anything, and that's not the truth. I would really, in our area, we're a major dairy state, so I always tell people, actually, you probably want to look for, if you're buying hay, probably dairy quality hay. But it's, we really look at they just don't eat everything, it just eats species that aren't maybe as common for other ruminants. But that's how we've focused on that for our hay as well too. So I will, when I'm done here, I will make sure I run the replay. So today we've talked a little bit about best pastures for goats, and then also hay for goats as well, just because that's the reality of where we live in the upper Midwest, and having needing to also think about that feed source for winter. And so also, I wanted to share too, if you missed this, or missed part of the earlier piece of my Q&A, I will have the live archive up shortly, but then also I have it posted on my blog with other show notes of some of the information I've talked about here. And if you don't always make my live Q&As, if you sign up for my email list, you can always get a notice when I have new replays up. That way you don't miss it. And then one last item is, in a couple of weeks, Thursday, August 4th, I'm going to be doing a live workshop called Raising Goats with Rotational Grazing. It's going to be in the evening, 7 to 8:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. And I will get more information in the replay for you on that. But if you're interested, just comment, or if you'd like the link, let me know and I can get that for you as well. But we'll cover some of these topics a little bit more in depth as it pertains to goats, especially meat goats and grazing on pasture. So have a good morning. I am going to get going. It's fair week here in our part of Wisconsin. And so I've got to get my son ready for the fair. He's a clover bud, his last year of clover bud. So we're not bringing livestock to show to the fair, but we do have a series of projects that we've got to get rolling for. So, that's where I'm off to this morning. So have a good morning, and thanks for joining me.